Today, we're going to examine a contradiction so small, so easy to overlook, that it quietly undermines everything we think we know about the Vikings, a contradiction hidden in maps, language, and silence. And once you see it, the familiar image of horned helmets and heroic sagas begins to dissolve. We are taught that the Vikings were Scandinavian warriors who erupted suddenly into history, raided Europe, then faded away. The timeline is neat, the narrative is comfortable, and that alone should concern us. Because real history is never neat. Our task today is not to invent a new past, but to examine why the official one avoids asking certain questions. We begin with a simple observation. If the Vikings dominated the northern seas for centuries, we would expect consistency. Consistency in names, consistency in language, consistency in how they described themselves. But that consistency does not exist. In medieval sources, northern peoples are called many things. Danes, Northmen, heathens, pirates, men from the sea, but almost never Vikings. The term appears sporadically, without clarity, without definition. This raises an uncomfortable question. If Vikings were a civilization, why did no one describe them that way at the time? Modern history presents Vikings as a people, but primary sources do not. In Old Norse texts, to go Viking meant something very specific. It meant an activity, a raid, a journey by sea, not a nation, not a race, not a civilization. Calling all Scandinavians Vikings is a retroactive label applied centuries later. This is not interpretation, it is linguistic fact. So why does modern history insist on treating Vikings as a unified culture? Because the alternative creates a vacuum, and history does not like vacuums. Now we arrive at the maps. 16th and 17th century cartographers depict the North in ways that do not align with modern geography. Not vaguely, not symbolically, but precisely. Rivers where none exist, lands where there is now ocean. Names that have no accepted origin. Official history explains this away as fantasy. But this explanation fails for one reason. The same cartographers accurately mapped coastlines thousands of kilometers away. Why were they precise everywhere except the north? It suggests they were not guessing. They were copying. Consider the longships. They appear suddenly in the archaeological record. Fully developed, ocean-capable, hydrodynamically optimized. There are no prototypes, no failed designs, no gradual evolution. This violates every known pattern of technological development. Civilizations do not invent perfection overnight, unless they inherit it, and that forces a question history avoids. Who possessed this knowledge before the so-called Vikings? Now consider climate. Geological evidence confirms that sea levels have changed dramatically in the recent past. Lower sea levels reveal vast northern shelves, land where today there is water. If those lands were inhabited, their disappearance would not be gradual, it would be catastrophic. People would flee south, knowledge would fragment, history would reset, survivors would appear suddenly with ships, with skills, without an origin story. This begins to resemble what we call Viking history. By the 19th century, Europe needed heroes, nations needed ancient roots, romanticism needed legends. And so the Viking was born. A composite figure stripped of contradictions, polished into myth. This new Viking explained everything, the ships, the raids, the sudden appearance, and conveniently erased deeper questions. Questions about what existed before. If the Vikings were not a civilization, but inheritors, if the ships predate them, if the maps remember lands now lost, then the real story of the North is not one of expansion, it is one of collapse. And what we call Viking history may simply be the echo of something far older, remembered incorrectly, because remembering it correctly would force us to rewrite everything. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. In the previous investigation, we approached the edges of a forbidden question. Not whether history was simplified, but how much was deliberately removed. Now we move from maps and names to something far more dangerous. Physical evidence. Objects you can touch. Bones you can measure. Materials that refuse to age according to the official calendar. This is the kind of evidence historians avoid discussing, not because it is weak, but because it is too strong. Today we will examine artifacts that exist in museums, archives, and storage rooms, yet do not fit anywhere on the accepted timeline of human development. And we will ask a simple but terrifying question. What if the problem is not the artifacts, but the timeline itself? Let us begin with something deceptively ordinary. Wood, according to modern science, untreated wood exposed to moisture, bacteria, and oxygen has a very limited lifespan, centuries at most, often far less. Yet across northern Europe, archaeologists continue to uncover wooden artifacts that behave as if time simply passed them by. Ship planks still dense and elastic. Carvings so sharp they appear freshly cut. Structural joints that have not collapsed or powdered into soil. We are told these objects are over 1,000 years old. We are also told this is completely normal, but it is not. In many cases, these objects were not preserved in peat bogs, not sealed in oxygen-free environments, not chemically treated. They lay in ordinary soil, wet soil, hostile soil, and yet they remain. The explanation usually offered is vague. Exceptional conditions, unusual luck, unique microclimates. But when exceptions become the rule, science stops being science. Next we examine swords, axes, rivets, and fasteners found across Scandinavia and northern Russia show a level of metallurgical precision that should not exist in the early Middle Ages. Uniform carbon distribution, advanced layering techniques, stress-resistant alloys. These are not crude tribal tools, they are products of systematic engineering knowledge. Yet we are told they were made by semi-literate farmers and fishermen with no centralized industry, no advanced furnaces, and no written technical tradition. This contradiction is quietly ignored. Artifacts are labeled, dates are assigned, and no one asks how societies described as primitive produced materials rivaling early modern craftsmanship. Now we come to the most uncomfortable evidence of all: human remains. Across the Baltic region, northern Russia, and Arctic Europe, archaeologists have uncovered skeletons that do not match modern human averages. These individuals were taller, heavier, structurally different. Their skulls display elongated shapes, thick cranial walls, and unusual proportions rarely seen today. These are not isolated deformities. They appear in groups, in cemeteries, in mass burials. Yet instead of questioning population history, the explanation is reduced to pathology, ritual deformation, or coincidence. Anything, as long as it does not suggest a biologically distinct population. All of these conclusions rest on one fragile pillar: dating. Radiocarbon dating is treated as absolute truth, but even its own creators warned against blind trust. Carbon dating assumes stable atmospheric conditions, stable cosmic radiation, stable biospheres. But what if the past was not stable? What if a recent global event altered carbon ratios, magnetic fields, or biological cycles? In that case, entire centuries could collapse into decades. Artifacts we think are ancient may be far more recent, and a civilization we believe died slowly over a millennium may have vanished abruptly. The evidence is waiting. The only thing missing is the courage to look. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. You'd expect fierce debate over these historical inconsistencies, right? But instead, there's just silence. Museums display artifacts without proper explanation. Academic papers dance around the big questions. Students are fed conclusions, but never shown the evidence that leads there. This isn't how science acts when it's confident. This is how institutions behave when the story is already written, and they refuse to change it. Acknowledging these anomalies would mean rewriting history, rethinking entire minds, and admitting our civilization inherited much more than it ever created. When we piece together all the evidence, the tools, the skeletons, the impossibly preserved materials, a disturbing picture emerges. It's not a picture of isolated tribes, but of a coherent, technologically advanced population that existed much later than we retold and vanished far more quickly than textbooks admit. A civilization with no name, leaving only fragments and shadows behind. Their memory doesn't live in history books, but in mislabeled artifacts and uncomfortable data that most are too afraid to touch. In our next investigation, we'll delve into something even more dangerous: architectural alignments that should not exist, and energy-focusing structures that have been misidentified as tombs. We'll explore why sacred geography all across Europe consistently points toward the far north. At that point, you'll see that coincidence is no longer a viable explanation, because when physical evidence, biology, and geography all contradict the established timeline, it's the timeline that is the problem. History isn't just missing a few pieces. It's missing entire centuries. And it seems someone worked very hard to make sure we would never notice. In our investigation, we've followed names that shouldn't exist, and artifacts that defy time. Now we confront the most dangerous layer of all, the landscape itself. Because buildings can lie, and artifacts can be misdated, but geography does not take orders. Across the globe, monumental structures share one disturbing trait: they were built in places no rational society would choose. High mountains, frozen tundra, unstable geological zones. Official history says primitive people built them, yet they show extreme precision and advanced math. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons are fitted so perfectly a blade can't slide between them. No mortar, no tool marks. Historians call them tombs or temples. But that collapses when we see where they're built. Many sit directly on fault lines, magnetic anomalies, and energy nodes. It's not random. It's a grid, a global network of infrastructure. And when you map them, their orientation consistently favors one place, the far north, the Arctic. What if these weren't temples, but terminals? Energy concentrators designed to interact with the Earth's natural frequencies. This wasn't primitive. It was a lost science, a global civilization, centered in the north, that collapsed abruptly. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. What if history did not slowly evolve, but was reset? What if entire civilizations were erased not by time, but by catastrophe, survival, and rewriting? We are not examining myths, we are examining what remains after something enormous disappears. Because when architecture, maps, technology, and geography all contradict the official timeline, the question is no longer what happened, the question becomes, who decided what we were allowed to remember? Across this series, we uncovered a pattern, not in one country, not in one culture, but everywhere. Advanced architecture appearing suddenly, with no prototypes, energy sites aligned with impossible precision, as if built from a single global blueprint, maps showing lands that officially never existed, charted with a knowledge we supposedly didn't have, and technologies that appear without any developmental stages, as if they were just found. History does not behave this way. Civilizations do not emerge fully formed. They leave trails. They leave a ladder of progress for us to see. Yet across the northern world, the trail is missing. And missing evidence is not an absence, it is a signal that something broke the timeline, leaving behind only the most resilient fragments. Almost every ancient culture shares one disturbing memory, a great inundation, a rising sea, a world that was before. This is not limited to religious texts, which are often dismissed as mere allegory. This memory appears in Scandinavian oral traditions of sunken realms. It's in Russian legends of submerged northern lands. It's embedded in indigenous Arctic accounts of the seas swallowing the coast. It's even in ancient Mediterranean writings describing cataclysms that changed the very shape of the world. Different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Same memory. Modern history treats this as a coincidence, a collection of unrelated local myths. But coincidence does not repeat itself globally. This is a shared trauma, a scar on the collective human psyche, pointing to a real event that reshaped our planet. If a large-scale environmental event, like a rapid sea level rise, occurred only centuries ago, not millennia, the implications are enormous. It would mean coastlines shifted rapidly, swallowing ports and cities. Global trade networks would collapse overnight. Entire populations would be forced to migrate en masse, becoming refugees in their own world. And most critically, knowledge would fragment. The complex systems that supported advanced science and engineering would be gone. Survivors would not rebuild civilization immediately. They would imitate fragments of what came before. This explains something textbooks cannot. Why later societies copy advanced architectural forms they cannot actually reproduce. Why once understood scientific knowledge appears ritualized, its original purpose forgotten. Why sacred architecture becomes symbolic rather than functional. They weren't building from scratch. They were preserving echoes. This isn't a theory of decline. It's a theory of survival and adaptation. The Vikings, we know the raiders, the explorers may not have been the beginning of a new age, but the fierce, resilient survivors of an old one. They carried the fragmented DNA of a lost civilization. Their longships were not an invention, but an inheritance. Their navigational skills were not new discoveries, but a remembered art. What we call the Dark Ages wasn't an era of ignorance. It was an era of recovery, an era where humanity tried to piece itself back together after the world broke. The official timeline insists on a slow, linear progression, but the evidence points to a different story, a sudden, catastrophic break, followed by a long, difficult reset. So, what have we uncovered in this journey? We've seen that the official story has holes, big ones. The Tartarian maps, the star fortresses, the lost technologies, the global flood memory, they all point to a chapter of history that has been deliberately ignored or rewritten. This isn't about one single conspiracy. It's about a paradigm that refuses to accept the possibility of a highly advanced, globally connected civilization that was reset just a few centuries ago. The evidence is not hidden. It's in plain sight, in the megaliths, in the maps, and in our own collective memory. The question is no longer if it happened, The question is, are we ready to accept what the evidence is telling us? History is not a closed book, it's a crime scene, and we are just beginning to uncover the truth. Thanks for joining us on this investigation. The story isn't over. Keep questioning everything. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. After a catastrophe, power vacuums emerge, new rulers rise, new borders are drawn, and most importantly, new narratives are crafted. A fractured world doesn't need the complex, messy truth. It needs order. And order is built on a simplified, sanitized version of history. Complex origins are seen as dangerous. The existence of lost civilizations raises uncomfortable questions. Alternative timelines and chronologies threaten the legitimacy of the new establishment. So, history is flattened, made linear, clean, and predictable. Anything that doesn't fit this neat little box is dismissed, reclassified as mere myth, a simple error, or pure fantasy. This is precisely where the Viking narrative becomes incredibly useful to the new powers. It's a single, convenient label, a simple explanation for a complex phenomenon. They weren't engineers, they weren't inheritors of ancient knowledge. They certainly weren't survivors of a forgotten world. No, they were just raiders. By reducing their identity to this one-dimensional caricature, the deeper, more challenging questions simply vanish. There's no need to ask where their advanced ships came from, no need to wonder who taught them sophisticated navigation, no need to explain why their technologies seem to outpace their cultural development. The myth absorbs the contradiction, smoothing over the cracks in the official story. Yet, despite centuries of this historical rewriting, some things could not be completely erased. Structures that refuse to decay. Anomalous skeletons that don't fit the accepted timeline. Impossible astronomical alignments built into ancient sites. Place names that have no linguistic roots in the known local languages. And, of course, the maps that knew far too much, showing coastlines and landmasses with impossible accuracy. These are not just mistakes or coincidences, they are leaks in the narrative. They are fragments of a history that refuses to stay buried, whispering to us from across the ages. This leads us to the most uncomfortable question of all. If history was reset once, could it happen again? Not through a great flood or a cataclysm of fire, but through a much quieter, more insidious process. Forgetting, it happens when data replaces memory, when convenience replaces genuine curiosity, and when questioning the past becomes discouraged, even taboo. Civilizations don't just collapse through violent destruction. They can also collapse through collective amnesia, a slow, silent erosion of who we are and where we came from. So here is the final revelation. The lost northern world wasn't erased because it failed. It was erased because it ended. And those who came after inherited only the pieces, without understanding the whole. They were left with fragments of a grand puzzle they could no longer solve. What we call mythology may simply be distorted memory. What we call fantasy might be misstated fact. And what we call impossible may simply belong to a chapter that was deliberately torn from the book of our shared history. History is not a closed system. It is an ongoing investigation, and the deeper you look, the more the official story begins to crack. This series ends here, but the questions do not, because once you see the fractures, you can't unsee them. Welcome to Hidden History Files. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.